January 2026 didn't arrive with sirens, explosions, or official statements. It arrived quietly. A plane touched down. A convoy rolled through Caracas. And before the world could react, Nicolás Maduro was no longer in the capital. History often misses the deeper story. This wasn't the result of a single raid, a sudden betrayal, or a dramatic coup. The moment the handcuffs clicked, the stage for his fall had already been set years earlier, in oil fields, central banks, and policy rooms. This is not a story about an arrest. It's the story of an economy collapsing so completely that it left its leader with nowhere left to hide. But this collapse wasn't the result of one mistake, or even one person's failings. It was a trap that initially rewarded success, and then punished it mercilessly. Venezuela should have been untouchable. Beneath its soil lay roughly 300 billion barrels of proven oil reserves. The largest on Earth, fertile lands, long coastlines, and a once-educated workforce only added to its apparent invincibility. Yet within a decade, nearly 80% of its wealth vanished without war, without natural disaster, without rebuilding anything of value. Prices became meaningless, salaries worthless, savings evaporated. The question we must ask is simple. How does a nation so rich collapse so completely? To understand, we need to trace the slow strangulation of Venezuela's economy, layer by layer, decade by decade. And this story begins not with politics, but with the promise of oil. For decades, Venezuela relied almost entirely on oil. Money flowed in, imports were cheap, farming declined, factories closed, the economy stopped producing for itself. Why would it, when oil could buy everything? Oil didn't destroy Venezuela because it disappeared. It destroyed Venezuela because it lasted too long. At first, this system seemed like a miracle. Money poured in, currency appeared strong, and living standards seemed to improve. Schools expanded, hospitals were built, roads paved. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming silent, invisible, deadly. By the time Maduro inherited power in 2013, the cracks had widened into chasms. The state oil company had lost its engineers and managers. Maintenance schedules were ignored. Pipelines rusted, equipment failed. Production numbers looked normal, but only on paper. When oil prices crashed in 2014, revenue vanished almost overnight. For the first time, it became painfully clear. The golden engine of Venezuela had been built on sand, yet there was still a path forward. Other nations had survived commodity crashes. But surviving required decisions the regime refused to make. Instead of conserving the remaining resources, they spent printed money and ignored the warning signs. By 2015, production had dropped by millions of barrels per day. Factories that depended on oil for energy stopped working. Ports clogged. Ships waited for fuel that never came. The illusion of wealth evaporated, and with it, the foundations of trust. With income gone and obligations mounting, Maduro turned to the central bank. Money was printed, then printed again. Inflation rose, then spiraled into hyperinflation. But hyperinflation didn't just raise prices. It erased the very concept of money. Prices shifted hourly, and workers had to spend their salaries immediately, or they were worthless. Cash became a liability. The bolívar ceased to function as a currency. People adapted or tried to. Shopkeepers hid goods. Citizens queued for hours, only to find shelves empty. The government imposed price controls, but these only made the shortages worse. Trust evaporated. Contracts became meaningless. Savings disappeared. Loans were impossible. The economy itself seemed to implode under the weight of invisible pressure. And then came hunger, but hunger didn't just weaken the population. It reshaped loyalty. Citizens began measuring survival, not just in calories, but in political compliance. By 2016, many Venezuelans were skipping meals. Weight loss became widespread, not by choice, but by necessity. Food had become a political weapon. Subsidized rations were distributed selectively. Loyalty was rewarded, dissent punished. Scarcity wasn't tolerated, it was weaponized. Families learned to navigate a system where access to bread or rice depended on compliance. Lines became places of negotiation, fear, and observation. Meanwhile, corruption flourished. Government programs designed to feed the population were exploited. Low-quality imports were overpriced. Contracts were siphoned into private hands. Children fainted in classrooms. Hospitals ran out of basic supplies, and yet those at the top continued profiting. Eventually, millions saw the only option left: escape. Nearly 8 million Venezuelans fled. Doctors, engineers, teachers, technicians, all vanished. Once a country begins exporting its workforce, collapse accelerates beyond what statistics can capture. Hospitals closed. Electricity failed. Water disappeared from taps. Machines keeping people alive stopped working. This wasn't sabotage. It was the logic of neglect reaching its breaking point. By 2019, the country plunged into darkness for days. Hospitals were paralyzed. Refrigeration systems failed. Supply chains collapsed. Even basic sanitation disappeared in many regions. Desperate, the regime allowed US dollars to circulate. For a brief moment, it seemed the collapse had paused. But this was not recovery. It was anesthesia. A two-tier society emerged: luxury for the few, scarcity for the many. Shelves filled. Restaurants reopened. The illusion of normalcy returned, but beneath it, nothing had been fixed. Schools barely functioned. Roads cracked. Power grids were unreliable. Venezuela had become a country that looked alive but was dying internally. With oil revenues gone and taxes absent, the government turned to resource extraction. Gold mining tore through protected lands. Military factions and criminal groups seized control of entire regions. Cash replaced institutions. The country was no longer governed. It was being liquidated. International isolation grew. Indictments were issued. Sanctions returned. Maduro ceased being treated like a president and became a liability, a symbol of failure. One last chance remained: a negotiated election, sanctions relief, and reintegration into the global economy. He refused. The vote was disputed. Investors fled. Loyalty became too expensive to maintain. Authoritarian regimes rarely fall because of protest. They fall when loyalty costs too much. By late 2025, Venezuela's institutions were hollow. When the final operation came in January 2026, resistance was minimal. The economy had already stripped the regime of its shield. The lesson is clear: you cannot print wealth, you cannot consume oil, you cannot rule over ruins forever. Venezuela lost nearly 80% of its economy. Millions were exiled. Its currency vanished. A generation bore deep scars. The man is gone. The damage remains. The economy removed the leader, but it didn't remove the devastation. Rebuilding will be harder than the collapse. Systems can fail faster than they can recover. Social trust, human capital, and infrastructure take decades to restore. That story hasn't ended. The path forward may prove even more shocking than the fall itself.